let you in on a secret here. I don't really have that much of a strategy in terms of what games I review and what games I play in what order for this channel. Honestly, most of the time I just play a game I'm interested in, and if I have enough to say about it, I'll write a review and produce a video about it. There are times when I make a video as a follow-up for something like the remastered Tony Hawk game I covered after I made that long retrospective, but that's more of an exception than a rule. But not every game offers enough to talk about to justify an entire video about it. As it happens, I just got done playing a few of those games, so just like last time when I did a Quickies episode, I'll be sharing my thoughts on a couple of games in this video. And just like last time, these aren't deep dives, either because there isn't that much to talk about, or because I don't want to unnecessarily spoil these games if you intend to pick them up. Please don't touch anything is exactly what you'd expect it to be from the title. You're locked in a room with a control panel that has a big red button in the middle of it, and you're told to not touch anything. It's straight out of the old Ren and Stimpy skit about the history eraser button. The console itself has a screen that depicts a city, and the implication is clear that if you were to push that button, something would happen to that city. And indeed, the aim of the game is to find as many ways to end civilization as possible. To wit, you need to solve a bunch of puzzles that arise from you first pushing that big red button, as well as observing your environment for clues. If your deductions are correct, new panels open up on the console for you to solve puzzles with. And every time you reach an ending, the game plays a little animation on the screen showing how the city gets destroyed, and it also causes the scenery around you to change in some way. And then the game resets entirely and you're back to square one with that big red button to try again. This 3D version is actually a remake of the original 2D pixel art game. Thankfully, it's been long enough since I've played the original that I didn't remember the solutions to all the puzzles when I played this remake, so it was still a nice little brain teaser experience to have. Overall, I enjoyed both the original and the remake. This isn't one of those games that appear to be deceptively simple on the surface only to hide more under the hood. It's really as simple as it looks, so if you get it, don't expect more than a handful of puzzles. That's not to say that some of those puzzles aren't quite hard to solve, but even then you'll be playing for 2 to 3 hours at the very most, even if you want to figure things out for yourself and not rely on a guide to get all the endings. Though I personally would recommend the original version over this remake. For one, it's cheaper while still essentially providing you with the same basic experience and the same puzzles. And second, I personally find that the pixel art aesthetic looks more cohesive, especially given that the 3D remake still uses the same animations on the screen that the original had. This isn't meant to say that this remake is bad somehow or that it doesn't look decent enough, it's just that the 3D version doesn't meaningfully expand upon the original in any way, and I personally just like the pixel art look more. Oftentimes, simplicity trumps complexity, and I can't think of anything more simple than dragging around my mouse across the screen while playing a game. Donut County's gameplay is exactly that. You control a hole in the ground, and you need to drag your mouse across the screen to move the hole to let stuff fall into it so it gets bigger and so it can swallow ever larger stuff. And that's pretty much it, it's Katamari Damacy in reverse. There are a few puzzles you have to solve with the hole itself, where the environment provides you with context and clues as to what you're supposed to do, but they're fairly few and far between. The only other mechanic is that sometimes your hole gets outfitted with a catapult that lets you launch certain things you swallow back up. There is a narrative to the game, but honestly I'm not sure why the developers even bothered having one. It's firmly on the quirky indie game end of the spectrum, where people talk in lol speak and every character is some quirky animal. It's honestly not even worth elaborating much on. While the writing of the characters is sometimes pretty decent, the irreverent tone and the overall lack of anything being taken seriously means that the story doesn't really have anything it wants to communicate, not even through satire, which the game would be perfectly set up for. And once again, this is one of those games that you can finish in under 2 hours. Given its limited gameplay, its irrelevant and not particularly interesting narrative and overall short length, especially considering the asking price, I'm not sure I can recommend this game. Now, a game I can absolutely recommend is Gorogoa. I think I've mentioned it a few times already in earlier reviews where I cover puzzle games, but I absolutely love games that deal with perspective. And even though Gorogoa is an entirely 2D affair, it still manages to beautifully implement perspective gameplay. Gameplay happens in up to 4 square windows arranged in a 2x2 grid. These windows use a typical point-and-click style interface to move around within them, either to move the field of view altogether or to zoom into certain parts of the environment to examine them. And you can also pick up either of the windows and rearrange them in the tiled main grid. The clever thing here is that sometimes the individual windows depict parts of the same scene, and when you line them up, they connect. Your job is to guide your main character through these dreamlike landscapes and also to solve a variety of puzzles using this technique. Sometimes you can also pick up only a certain layer of the current window so that one image splits and subsequently shows an entirely different scene on the lower layers, as if you're rearranging paper cutouts. Now I'm keeping this intentionally short and vague because I don't want to show too much of the game here in order to not spoil the puzzle solutions, since I really think that this game deserves to be played. Though again, this too is a pretty short game that barely clocks in at 90 minutes. And even though I can tell that a lot of effort went into the making of this game, especially given the gorgeous hand-drawn animation, I still feel that it's a bit on the expensive side for the amount of gameplay it offers. Maybe hold out for a sale on this one, but absolutely check it out when you can. It's beautiful and utterly unique. Have you ever thought you could design a better public transport system than the one you have to endure every day? Well, now you can try with Mini Metro. This is a neat little strategy game that tasks you with designing an efficient subway system for an ever-growing city. The gist here is that the stations you have to connect aren't specific destinations that your little abstract travelers intend to reach. Instead, each traveler has a shape which corresponds to the shape of the station they want to arrive at. What sounds simple at first can become quite complex over time, because the game spawns in new stations at random. And the game has a nasty habit of spawning a bunch of the same stations quite close to each other. So if, say, you have a bunch of circle stations crowding up the place, it can cause your subway network to spiral into chaos because nobody from those stations wants to travel to another circle. They all want to get to a square or a triangle or something else. And if your subway cart is already filled up with passengers from that first circle on their route, all subsequent passengers get left waiting, and if they have to wait too long, you lose the game. On the other end of the spectrum, the game can also spawn in a single solitary special type of station like a star or a cross. And if travelers from all over town want to reach that particular station, you can end up clogging your lines exclusively with passengers to those unique stations, so the rest of the system can become clogged and corrupted because of that. It takes a bit of thinking and planning around these roadblocks to build an effective subway system. Overall, I really like the escalating nature of how the cities progress. However, I do feel that this aforementioned habit of the game spawning too many similar stations near each other can end up being a bit of an annoyance at times. Because at that point it's not really about following a transportation strategy anymore and just boils down to sheer dumb luck if you can even connect these stations in a manner that doesn't clog up the system. But still, it's a neat little game with a beautiful clean aesthetic, a wonderful procedural soundtrack, and quite a bit of replay value if you're intent on reaching the top of the online leaderboards. No, this isn't some kind of long-running adaptation of the movie The Room. That's better. I've been a fan of this series for quite a while now. Remember those Escape the Room flash games like Crimson Room that were popular on sites like Newgrounds a few years ago? Well, this is basically the same thing, only you're not trying to get out of a room, you're trying to get into something. In this case, it's a dollhouse that contains a handful of rooms filled with puzzle boxes. The concept is fairly straightforward. You have to find ways to open up a variety of objects to retrieve items from them that allow you to unlock additional rooms in the dollhouse. What I've always liked about this series is that it makes it unmistakably clear whenever you've passed a specific hurdle, so you can be sure that something from before wouldn't come up again later, while still feeling like a cohesive singular experience. In this case, whenever one of the rooms in the dollhouse has been entirely solved, it cuts off your access to that room entirely, so you're not left revisiting every room if you come to a dead end and don't know where you have to go next. There's a definite sense of progression through the dollhouse, and I love how quite a few puzzles require you to visit multiple rooms to solve them. While these games usually do feature some kind of narrative, it tends to take a backseat to the puzzles, and this game is no exception. The games feature a very Lovecraftian feel, where characters are in search of the null, some kind of mysterious, quasi-magical fifth element type of thing that's never explained all that thoroughly. This time around, the story revolves around a couple who lived in the house in whose attic the dollhouse is located. The dollhouse is an exact replica of the manor itself, so there's a recursive bent to the narrative where you explore other versions of the house you're currently in dollhouse form. The null has caused the husband to go insane, as these objects in Lovecraftian fiction tend to do, and his wife decided to hide the null inside the dollhouse and flee the manor. And that's about the extent of the narrative. There are notes you can find that do provide a bit of additional flavor, but honestly, I personally was never into this series either because of the narrative or the Lovecraftian atmosphere, even though the latter isn't particularly unwelcome either. It was always the puzzles that mattered to me, and just like the first 3 games, this one has it where it counts, along with gorgeously designed objects and locations. These games are usually first designed for mobile devices and then completely retooled for desktop users, and I really like how the developers take the time and effort to polish up this stuff for players with hardware that can be taken advantage of. If you haven't heard of this series before and you enjoy puzzles, definitely give them a look, they're well worth the money. This is also one of those rare series that gets better over time. That's not to say that the early games aren't good, they are, but it's nice to see how the developers continuously top themselves, and I look forward to how this series continues. Paradigm is the kind of game that, when you describe it to someone or when you watch the trailer, sounds really enticing and worthwhile. But at least when I ended up actually playing it, I found it to be kind of a letdown. At its core, Paradigm is a classic point-and-click adventure game in the grand tradition of LucasArts' landmark titles like Secret of Monkey Island or Day of the Tentacle, so there isn't really all that much to discuss in terms of gameplay. You click on things to investigate them, pick up items, use items on things, and talk to characters. And the main meat and potatoes of the gameplay are navigating these conversations and finding solutions to puzzles, all standard adventure game fare. The puzzles themselves are largely straightforward and thankfully don't fall into the very common adventure game trap of requiring massive leaps of logic. But the puzzles honestly also aren't the main focus of the game. Heck, it's not even the narrative itself that takes center stage. No, what this game is really about is to be surreal, quirky, and offbeat. It wants to subvert expectations and offer as many absurd twists and turns as possible, and derive comedy from those juxtapositions of the mundane in outlandish situations and vice versa. That in itself would be fine, I do enjoy surreal media in general, but unfortunately Paradigm simply can't manage to keep up the pace needed for something like this to be enjoyable for long stretches of time. I think this is where the genre of gameplay and the style of the visuals and the narrative are at odds with each other. To make surrealism work often requires that you catch your audience off guard, and that only happens when you have a degree of normality to juxtapose your weirdness with. While this may be the case when you first boot up the game, because you have no frame of reference of what to expect from the game without having played it, the baseline that the world, characters, and narrative of Paradigm operate on quickly become the new normal in the scope of the game itself. So when you investigate every item you can click on, and the eponymous main character responds with a quirky line that intends to subvert whatever expectation you might have had and intends to make you laugh with that assumed subversion, it quickly happened that I as a player didn't have any expectations whatsoever. As a result, all that subversion didn't work on me and I really didn't end up laughing all that often. And a side effect of that is that all of these forced quirky responses start feeling like wastes of time, done so more out of a sense of obligation rather than actually having something funny to say. You must have a line for every item because that's standard convention in point-and-click adventure games. And if you want to be a comedy game, you also have to make every line a potential joke. And unfortunately, Paradigm has way more misses than hits, particularly because many of those lines are also longer than they needed to be. In the end, I quickly grew bored of the game overall. It doesn't really help that the game doesn't have a narrative that's worth being taken seriously. The story operates on the same general detached and facetious level that the humor inhabits, and as such there's no variety at all. As weird and surreal as the setting, characters and situations may appear to anyone comparing it to our real world, if you only look at what Paradigm contains itself, it's all a fairly homogeneous mass that doesn't really offer much beyond the initial amusement of its quirky nature. It does try somewhat to stray from the typical point-and-click formula by having short sequences that parody other genres like dating sims, JRPGs, or side-scrolling beat-em-ups, but they're intended as mere punchlines and as such also don't offer anything noteworthy in and of themselves. To me, Paradigm feels like a joke that has been needlessly stretched out way past its breaking point. The surreal nature of the game quickly loses its novelty, and what you're left with is a lot of tedious forced comedy and a narrative that won't end up sticking with you in the long run. Since nothing in it is intended to be taken seriously, there's nothing worth provisioning mental storage space for to keep around long term. And that's a shame, because I do quite enjoy the kitschy visuals and the offbeat music, and I'm not saying that the entire project is outright terrible. But the lack of variety and the forced surreal comedy meant that I didn't really enjoy most of my time with Paradigm. thank you very much for watching. It was fun going back to some shorter games and get out a video that didn't require sifting through dozens of hours of gameplay footage to illustrate the points I'm talking about. I'll have to do that again sometime. What do you guys think? Should this be a more regular occurrence here on this channel, or should I stick to individual reviews? Anyway, right now I'm in the mood to play something a bit more substantial again, so next time there will be a proper full review once again.